All right, so what I want to do is to talk about what happens in your mind and your brain while you design. The mind is that sort of liminal, that funny idea that sits between your brain, which is a physical thing, and the outside world. Exactly what it is hard to be clear about, but just because we can't see it and we lack some clarity doesn't mean we can't measure things about it. And this is not the time to tell you all about that, but the fact that we can measure what's happening in your mind is really important, because that's what I'm going to talk about. And then we can measure what's happening in your brain. And your brain is this organ that sits inside your skull. And it's a very funny organ, because when you cut it open, which we try not to do too often, you don't see thought. You don't see the mind. You see something else. So that's what I want to talk about. But if you're a psychologist, you study the mind rather differently than I'm interested in, and I hope you are interested in. And that's because, and this is dedicated to the psychologists in the room, they take a very reductionist view. What does that mean? They take the world and in a good scientific way, take a small slice of it and study it. And that's a really successful way of studying the world. Not so good at studying design. And why? Well, firstly, in design, the task is not fixed. You're given something and then you have to, some kind of prompt. Maybe it comes from a client or from a little higher up in the organization. And exactly what you have to do isn't laid down. Whereas if someone says, what is 2 plus 2? It's pretty clear what you have to do. And a designer creates the problem partly, although often we don't use the word problem. In cognitive psychology, they call this problem finding. In psychology, and in lots of other areas, as I said, you try and isolate something and study it. And this has been hugely successful. It tells us about the world this way. But design consists of lots of cognitive actions. What do we mean by cognitive? The stuff that happens in your mind. It's a very rich ecology, quite hard, not impossible, but quite hard to say, oh, this is the thing, this little bit here. But you may not have participated in them, but there's a lot of psychometric tests. These are tests to try and determine something about your psychology. The alternative uses task is one of these. And that's often associated with creativity. What does that say? Here's a brick. Think of all the things you can use a brick for. Really interesting question. Not one you hear very often in design. In fact, in design, it's almost the opposite. I want to do something. What are the different ways I can do it? Then we get more serious. In problems that we understand, we know when we reach the end, because the criterion or criteria for making the final decision are known before we start. In design, often the criteria is a function of what you do, where you end up. And that's, in cognition terms, is often called situated cognition. In many things, and design is one of them, past decisions get changed. You know, you decide you'll put something here, and then later on you take it away. Or you do something that gets rid of that whole area completely. This is called non-monotonicity. Problem and solution co-evolve. That is, what you're interested in is often connected to what you've done. And there's this back and forth. So what I want to talk about first is how we study your mind and what can we find as you design. And this we've called design cognition, studying the mind as you design. There's various ways to do it, but the way I want to talk about today is called protocol analysis, which is a shorthand way of saying data from verbal utterances. And why is that interesting? Because the only way we can gain access to what's happening in your mind is if you externalize it. We can't see your mind. And the most common way for humans to externalize their thoughts is by verbalization. When you talk to each other, when you're explaining things, that's not to say you don't do thinking without verbalization. And you use your hands, you gesture. Sometimes the gestures mean something, sometimes they don't. And we sketch. And we have other languages, but they're all to do with externalization. And protocol analysis deals specifically with verbal externalization. And this is the sort of thing. So these are two students designing something.
Sorry.
Come on in. You haven't missed the best part yet. And here's another two students who are doing the same task, and they're naturally talking to each other. No, we don't ask them to do anything. It's a bit fuzzy intentionally. This is in a commercial organization. We put a camera up in the ceiling and we walk away and people are designing. And we capture what they do. This is some work where people are designing remotely. But all of them share this one thing: we capture their verbalization. And what we do is we transcribe that and then we code it up in some way. Now, what that means is we take the words and allocate them to some code. So, for example, if you know about function, behavior, structure, one of the ways we code them up is whether they're function, behavior, or structure. Or we code them as to whether they're talking about the problem or talking about the solution. Or we might code them as person A talks and person B talks. Or we might code them in other ways. But coding them is all about taking words, of which there are many, and bringing it down to a small number of categories. And that's what I want to talk about here. So here's an example of a study looking at the effect of selecting a major in a university. These are all engineering students. We get them to do some design work when they start in their first year. And then we look at people who chose engineering mechanics and people who chose mechanical engineering design, and see what differences occurred due to their education in terms of their cognition as measured by these categories. And it doesn't matter that much what these categories are. I mean, it matters to us specifically, but the point I want to make here is that we can measure changes in people's cognition. And if you look here, the blue is people who did mechanical engineering, and the red is people who do engineering mechanics. And engineering mechanics, that's about building mathematical models of physical systems. Mechanical engineering is about designing. And what we see here, these are the percentage differences from first year to third year in their cognitive behavior when designing. And we can see there are quite big differences, say, between engineering mechanics students and mechanical engineering students in this category about whether they're looking at the behavior of the thing they've designed. Whereas we can see that mechanical engineers put a lot more effort as they've moved on into talking about function compared to people doing engineering mechanics. So we've been able to find this quantifiable information by listening to them as they design. And we can take this idea and apply it everywhere where people talk while they're designing. So here's an example where we're looking at 3 groups of teams of designers. The yellow are industrial designers, the dark red are mechanical engineers, and in between are mixed teams. And what we're measuring with this thing called the PS index is, again, listening to them and categorizing what they're saying into either the problem area, the problem space, or the solution space, and dividing one by the other. So and we call this the PS index. And what is that telling us? It tells us the ratio of their cognitive effort put into thinking about the problem or thinking about, and the solution. So if it's 1, it means they're putting the same amount of effort. If it's more than 1, it means they're putting more cognitive effort, which is a sort of technical term for thinking, into thinking about the problem. And if it's less than 1, thinking about the solution. And the task we have here is a task which people know very well. It's a design task, but the task they know well. And we can see that industrial designers put a lot more effort into thinking about the solution, about the problem than mechanical engineers. And this is, we've measured this all over the place, all over the world, and this is the case. But look at what happens when we give people a task they're not familiar with. You can't go into your memory and pull up stuff. Actually, you can't even go to magazines and pull up stuff. And this is what happens. Look at mechanical engineers, where they put their cognitive effort hardly changes. Even though the task really is about the problem. And what's happened to industrial designers? They've really shifted their effort into thinking more and more about the problem. And this is a function of education. It also tells you something about the likelihood of mechanical engineers coming up with ideas about the task is going to be much lower because they're not putting much effort into the thinking about the task. So what happens here is mechanical engineers convert the problem into something they really understand and then proceed. So there's something fundamentally different happening now. Just even where do designers spend their time in terms of problem and solution space? This is a team of product service system designers. And red is where they spend time in the solution space, and time is the horizontal axis. It's got a funny numbering system, but forget about that. And blue is the problem space. And there's something really interesting here, which we see regularly. Right at the beginning, they already start talking about solutions. Yet, theoretically, you should be thinking about the problem for a long time before you start producing solutions. But in practice, that's not what people do. So, all this is showing us that we can gain access to people's cognition, that is, what's happening in their mind, by listening to them. It's not the only way. There's other ways, but that's the way I'm talking about here. And if we take this PS index again, this notion of putting the cognitive effort on problem over the cognitive effort on the solution, and take design sessions, now this is time, and just divide them into tenths, deciles. And this is, this is the result for 20-odd people. Brainstorming is blue, and TRIZ, does anybody know what TRIZ? No, one, good. I was hoping you would put your hand up. TRIZ is the only design method to come out of the Soviet Union. It hasn't escaped, I shouldn't say anything. TRIZ is the Russian acronym for inventive machine. One guy, Georg Altschuler, I won't give you the history of it, but it's a method for, really a very sophisticated method for forcing you to think about, put yourself in the problem space, and then it connects you to things. And look at the same people when they're doing brainstorming or just free ideation. You can see that they never put more effort into the problem. They always just, and that's what brainstorming is about, coming up with solutions. And it always dips down, so at the end it's lower than the beginning. TRIZ forces you to put more of your thought, more of your cognitive effort into the problem. And if you measure the creativity of the designs produced, TRIZ outperforms brainstorming almost all the time. And then here's something quite different now. But again, we're always looking at what happens in the mind. Here we've got, in this case, we're looking at teams of mechanical and electrical engineers. So this is 57 professional engineers, people who've practiced for at least 10 years. And they're in teams of 3. And what we're interested in is what's the interaction between mechanical engineers' ideas and electrical engineers' ideas working on the problem. It's one problem. They're all actually working on the one problem. And we talk about design spaces. I'm going to show you a design space. It's not just an idea. It's a thing. And this is a design space. And let me tell you what's here. What is a design space? A design space starts off with every single idea that the designers mention. That's all we have. We don't know what else is in there because they haven't told us. They haven't mentioned it. But since these people are talking to each other, there's a natural flow of all the ideas that they're interested in. So that's the first thing. And you can count up every one of these ideas. So you can count how big this space is and the number of ideas. Secondly, in this case, this is these 57 engineers in 19 teams of 3. The size of the lettering on this graph, because this is a graph, and a graph consists of nodes and arcs. The size of the lettering on the nodes is the number of teams that mentioned this idea. The bigger, the more teams mentioned it. The smaller, the fewer the teams. So these ones around the periphery were mentioned by one team only. And then there's connections between the ideas. And these connections are, there's many ways to measure connections between ideas. You could measure them, say, if one idea follows another. Presumably they're connected somehow. And that's what's done here, but there's other ways to do it. And that gives us the arcs, that is, the lines between the nodes, and their thicknesses are how many teams had those connections. So when we look here, we can see really thick lines, meaning all the teams used those ideas and connected them. And now we come to what this part of this was about, which is mechanical engineers and electrical engineers. The blue here is the mechanical engineers, and, or maybe it's the other way around, it actually doesn't matter when I'm showing this, and the pink is the electrical engineers. So now we have represented graphically where these people are focusing in this design session, which was 1 hour long. And we see, just by observation, we can do these statistics, that these guys like to talk to each other, and these guys like to talk to each other, and there's some overlap, but they actually put most of their effort talking to each other. That electrical engineers talk to electrical engineers, and mechanical engineers talk to mechanical engineers in terms of their ideas, so that their interactions are somewhat less than you might imagine just by looking at them, at what they're doing. And then you can look at this over time. This is just, we've taken every session and said this is what it looks like, but you can track this over time. And what you find is an ebb and flow between the ideas put forward by electrical engineers and the ideas put forward by mechanical engineers and their interactions. And there's much fewer interactions than it sounds like when you listen to them. You can now take what's behind this, which is the introduction of ideas, and apply it to design crits, say, for example. So here's some work. Hadass Sofer is in Israel, and we're looking at the effect of VR, immersive VR, on the interaction between the student and the tutor. So that's what we want to find out. Is immersive VR making the student more engaged or less engaged? First thing I want to say is the tutor is not a novice in immersive VR, and nor is the student or the students. And it so happens the pedagogy in the studio is that on Mondays they do, it's all face-to-face, but on Mondays they use a non-immersive system, which just does a computer display on a desktop. And on Wednesdays they use immersive VR. It's I think it's an 8-meter wide display. And what we see, we can measure. So each one of these is a crit. And we're looking at the distribution of the ideas, which are called first occurrence ideas. So whoever brought in the idea first. And what we see here is that students introduce a lot fewer ideas than the tutor. The tutor's down the bottom. In immersive VR, we see quite a dramatic change. And this is a measure of engagement. If the student is introducing ideas, it's because they're engaged more. Now we have been able to measure quantitatively the effect of different media in a design crit. This is not designing, this is a design crit. So, I could go on, but I want to tell you about what happens in your brain now while you're designing. And this is called design neurocognition. And to do that, you need to gain access to activity in the brain. Now, if you're a rat, we cut your brain open. We don't find thought there, so that's not a useful thing anyway, fortunately, because there's always going to be somebody who would cut a human's head open for the fun of it. So clearly that's not what we're going to do. We're not looking for thought. So what are we looking for? We assume, and it's a pretty good assumption, that thought and brain activity are connected. If you don't assume that, you're in trouble, right? Thought and brain activity are connected. So what we want to measure, since we can't measure thought, which is cognition, we're going to measure brain activity. And now, what is brain activity? Well, firstly, the brain is big. But I don't mean in dimension across here, but as you know, the brain is made up of, it's sort of like a network, but don't take that too directly. It's made up of neurons, which are cells, and connections between them, axons. There's some debate as to how many neurons, between 50 billion and 80 billion neurons. That's a big number, by the way. And since any neuron can potentially connect with any other neuron, although they don't, you don't have to be very smart to think 50 billion by 50 billion is a really big number, right? So there's a lot going on there. But, so we can't measure all that. And when you go inside the brain, what do you find as you start to look at this? The first thing you find is the blood flowing. Why? Because any cell in the body requires energy to do anything. Energy is transported through the blood in the oxygen molecules, right? So suddenly we have a connection. If there's activity, it wants more oxygen. So if we could measure oxygen, we have a proxy for activity. We also discover that there's a huge amount of electrical activity going on in the brain. So maybe we can measure electrical activity. And that's what I want to talk about. So these are called non-invasive measurements because we don't stick our finger in there. Right? The first method I want to talk about is EEG, electroencephalography. The part that's most interesting in the brain, and you probably know this, is like a fairly thin sheet that's all crumpled up that sits at the top of the brain. It starts here and sort of runs back to here. It's called the prefrontal cortex. It's The brain has evolved over time. Down the bottom, near the top of the spine, is the oldest part of the brain, often called the reptilian brain, because we share that with reptiles. Right? Color, basic movement, position, things like that. But as we get further, there's more of the brain that was developed over time, things like facial recognition, which turns out to be critically important if someone's coming towards you, and you've got to decide whether you're going to throw a spear at them or embrace them, because that seemed to be the alternatives. But it's only much later that all what we call reasoning, and that appears in this prefrontal cortex, which is this, when you lay it out flat, it's only this big, but it's get all crumpled up into the brain. So it's relatively thin, and when neurons fire, there's electrical signals, and they tend to be in columns in the neuron, in the prefrontal cortex, and therefore electrical energy escapes through the skull, and that's what this measures. It doesn't measure what's inside, it measures what comes out. And again, we assume that more activity means more thinking, more cognitive activity. So here's actually quite a large study carried out with Sonia Vieira, where we're looking at all sorts of things. I mean, large here means we did over 100 people. And let me show you, here's the device we used. Cost $895. Okay, today that's thousands of euros, but a few years ago it was, 500 euros. Really cheap. Of course, in return, the quality of the signal you get is not so good. There's standard places on the skull where you put channels of measurement, and this is where we put these. And we gave people a bunch of tasks, which are all connected to each other, the tasks. And we put everything onto a screen. So we look at what they're doing on the task, we look at their face, we look at their brain activity, and so on. And what we're measuring is what's here. This is actually what we're measuring. And these are just electrical signals that you have to do a lot of work on. Of course, if you know anything about analyzing anything to do with electricity, there's a lot of noise. What is noise? Stuff that occurs because electrons are running past things. So you have to denoise it, and that's a big problem. People who show you images like this in real time, that's nonsense. I mean, that's real-time nonsense there, but be careful. Okay, so this is the kind of thing we gave people. Here's a room, it's all defined. Here's some furniture. And the first problem is put the bed next to this and put the wardrobe next to this and so on. So it's highly constrained. And slowly we reduce the constraints until actually you can move everything, including the walls. And then finally we say, here's an open task. So So it's a series of design tasks that start off as sort of problem solving. Really, there's only like 4 answers possible for laying it out until it's completely open. And here's some results. So what are we looking at first? We're looking down on the brain. So this is the middle of the brain, and your nose is up here. And these are the international standard labels for the measurement, for the channels that we're measuring. And this is the left hemisphere, and that's the right hemisphere. And this is a spider graph, or there's lots of polar graph, or whatever label you want to give it. And we're measuring the amount of activity, right? So there's 0. If it's below 0, it means there's less activity than when we started. And if it's above 0, it says there's more activity than when we started. And what we're looking at here is these tasks, which I mentioned, that are these increasingly open tasks. And where we see a solid dot is where there's some statistically significant difference between that task and the first task. So there's a lot of data here, but just look at it and just see, okay, we can now see which parts of the brain, of this prefrontal cortex, this layer up here, are different in different tasks. And on the left are the mechanical engineers. This is about 20 people. And on the right are industrial designers. These are all professionals. No students here. And what we see is something really interesting. Industrial designers activate their brain more than mechanical engineers. Now, we saw cognitively, mechanical engineers and industrial designers are different. And it turns out their brain behavior is different. Now, we don't have many mechanical engineers, so I can say this. It makes it look like they don't do much work. But if this was a mechanical engineering audience, those industrial designers have to work a lot harder, don't they? We don't know. We just don't know what all this is telling us. It's telling us something, but we don't have any theoretical underpinnings to tell us what all this means. So what we have is contrast. But we can do all sorts of things. This is taking design sessions and dividing them into deciles, into 1/10. And just look, just glance over it, you'll see that they're different because designing is different across time. And we can do the same with, say, gender. Female, male, female, male, doing the same task. There's differences. The brains of males and females behave differently. But so do those of mechanical engineers and industrial designers, and architects, by the way, and graphics designers. We can find all sorts of things. So one of the things we often do is we get people to do creativity tests. One of the psychometric tests I was making nasty comments about. But it turns out they're not that bad. On the top is the brain behavior. This is a heat map. The more to the red, the more brain activity. Blue means there's less than before. More creative subjects, that is, people who perform well on those creativity tests, and people who perform right down the bottom. And you can see, without measurement, statistically, there's fundamental differences. What is this telling us? Maybe we shouldn't teach everybody exactly the same way. They're different. I mean, really different. Another way to get inside the brain is called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. Before you leave, you have to be able to pronounce that. And what it does is it shines infrared light into your brain. This is all approved, it's okay. I won't do it, but and measures the reflectance. And with that, it can tell you how much oxygen and so on. And the question a lot of people talk about is left brain, right brain. Well, it turns out it's not that simple. It depends what you're doing. Brainstorming, This is deciles across the bottom. And this is left brain activity is green, right brain is red, and they always add up to 100%. All right, so it's only the distribution of activity. Brainstorming, it starts off all left brain. I don't know if you know the method morphological analysis, and actually it doesn't matter. It's just another method, more structured. And look, its left brain activity is dominant towards the end. And this tris that I mentioned, it's all over the place. It forces you to engage both sides of your brain. So by teaching people design techniques, we change their brain behavior, which is good to see, because if you're a professor and you're teaching stuff and nothing happens to your students, you should probably stop collecting your money. And then all sorts of stuff. I mean, all of this, this is some work done in Korea, where we're looking at VR versus a computer display. The same image, right? And again, we can see that VR engages a lot more. Now, when we're up the back here, we're looking at visual activity, and it's not surprising. We see a lot more demand on your cognition if you're doing VR. Here's something people, cognitive scientists talk about is offloading cognition. The idea that you can put stuff outside you so you don't have to think about it anymore, and then you can bring it back. And of course, as designers, we do this all the time. That's what sketching does for us. It does other things, but it offloads cognition. And the question is that what happens? Or is this one of those urban claims that we happily make? So this is using functional near infrared spectroscopy, FNIRS for short. This is, 15, 30 students. The offloading cognition is a concept map. Do you know what concept maps are? Does that? No. Anyway, you'll see in a minute. So this is what we get for people who are framing a task, actually, without a concept map, and then with a concept map. And what do we find? Firstly, there's big shifts. Using this changes what happens in your brain. And two things happen. When you compare it, one is that really the left part of the brain has lower, not just lower, but has less activity than when nothing's happening, because there's no such thing as nothing happening, but from when we start. And if we add up all the cognitive activity that this is measuring, there's a lot less here than there is there. So, yes, offloading cognition is a real thing. And then we can measure things about your concept map and connect it to your brain behavior. And then there's all this other stuff, and I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, but you'll get the idea. Now, which part of your brain is more active? Because that's sort of a silly question, because the whole brain is active. It's never just, when you're asleep, it's almost as active as when you're awake, if you take away motor activity. But when you're thinking intentionally, there's lots of changes. So here's, and don't get too enmeshed in it, but these are the places we're measuring, these colored dots. The colors refer to different anatomical regions in the brain. And it says when you start, this is the most active part of the brain. Got to be careful now because we're looking directly at the brain, right? So if we're looking at the brain, this is the left and this is the right. And this is the path of the most active regions of the brain while people are brainstorming. When they're doing morphological analysis, totally different. Right? This still crosses the hemispheres. And then when we get to TRIZ, TRIZ is really different. And we can plot that over the anatomical regions, and those are associated with these different cognitive behaviors. So now we can start to unpack a little bit more about how the brain is driven by and drives designing. And then we can do the same about, so that's which is more active, but designing is about connecting things. Which is the part that's most connected? And now we're using a heat map. So when you're doing, this is looking at just reading the brief. You see it's the left. When you start framing the problem, it's the right. And when you start deciding on all the things you're going to do, it's sort of, funnily enough, not that much happening. Turns out that's not a high cognitive load. And synthesizing, putting one idea down after the other, the most connected part is right here. It runs between the left and right. So, I could show you a lot more, but you get the idea. We now can find out about your mind. We can measure things about it. We can find out about your brain activity while you're designing, measure things about it. We can use that to check all these claims that we've been making for 150 years about designing. There's a lot more. But beyond that, what can you do? And we found all this stuff. It's exciting. The images are dramatic. And there's knowledge here of a kind that people never had before. Right? It's all new. So here's an idea. What happens if I tell you, or I show you, you see your brain, that image of your brain, and you see this part that's red, that's when you're coming up with ideas. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this image, or a version of it, up in the corner of the screen while you're designing, and tell you, you see that part that's red? Keep it red. You say, now wait a minute. Nobody knows how to keep it red. Nobody. But something humans have, which is called self-regulation. You can make your body and mind do things without knowing how. One of the things is called learning. You have no idea how you learn, but you do learn. So here's this idea. It's called neurocognitive feedback. The idea is not new, but no one has ever done it with design. Let's see what it does. So here's the result of, I've forgotten whether it's 15 or 30 people. The blue is when people aren't shown anything. And the red is when they have neurocognitive feedback. And we see that we've changed brain activity. Not only that, we can look at individuals. This is individual 1. Blue is left hemisphere dominance at that time. Yellow is right hemisphere dominance. And when we give them neurofeedback, it all changes. The right hemisphere, not all, but it changes to more right hemisphere. These are individuals. And then when we look at the results, they produce twice the number of ideas. You can produce twice the number of ideas. And this applies to everybody. With this simple neurocognitive feedback. And one can imagine a lot more. We measure your brain activity. In this case, we're using this functional infrared spectroscopy, and we turn your brain activity into a heat map. It's a graphical representation. Red is that part of your brain that is working the hardest. And what we do is, in real time, or with a delay of about a couple of seconds or less, we put that up in the corner of the computer screen you're working on, and all we say is, keep that part red. That's it. So, today we have much more sophisticated devices. We have permission to use his face. That's my colleague. We have, and now we have even these little patches we can put on people. So where does all this fit? We can measure design thinking in lots of ways. We can measure design cognition. We have different ways of doing that. I haven't talked about measuring physiology. Where do you move your eyes? What happens to your heart rate when you're designing? It turns out your emotions affect the sweat on your skin, which you know nothing about, and we can measure the change in that. So we get some idea about that. And we can measure emotions by looking at your face, your facial muscles. And what I've talked about is design cognition and design neurocognition. What this has opened up for us is the ability to know more and to use that knowledge then to start feeding back with the goal of improving designs. And with that, thank you.